Before we begin, tell me something. Have you ever woken up and felt like the world didn't remember you? As if your name had been quietly erased from every mouth, even your own? That eerie stillness, not outside you, but within, like you were missing from yourself. That's how his story begins. And perhaps it's how yours does too. High in the folds of a forgotten mountain, there was a monastery that didn't exist on maps, only in memories that people weren't sure were real. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It had no gold, no gates, no grand sermons, only stillness. And in that stillness lived a monk. His name? Irrelevant. At least now. For 23 years, he lived the same sacred rhythm. Rise before the sun, bow to the east, chant the names of gods older than language, sweep the stone floors with hands that touched every corner of silence. He was not a master, not a legend, just devoted, humble, quiet, predictable, until one morning, that all shattered. It began at dawn. The sky wore its usual pale silver. The birds began to stretch their wings. But something was wrong. He opened his eyes, and the world didn't recognize him. Worse, he didn't recognize himself. The moment he stood up from his straw mat, he realized something was missing. It wasn't his robe, not his prayer beads, not even a memory. It was his center, his anchor. His name, whatever it once meant, was gone. He looked around his small quarters. The incense still burned softly, curling towards the open window. The scriptures still hung in place. The little bowl of water still shimmered near his bedside, but none of it felt familiar. Not foreign, just hollow, like walking through a house that once belonged to someone you loved, now filled with shadows where laughter used to live. He opened his mouth to recite the morning mantra. Nothing, not a word, not even the urge. It was as if his soul's tongue had gone numb. He stepped out into the hallway. Other monks passed him with kind nods. "Peace to you," they whispered, using his name. He stared blankly. That name, those syllables, they bounced off him like rain on stone. Empty sounds. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond. They said it again, softer. "Are you well, brother?" He smiled politely. A smile that hid something vast and terrifying. A smile people wear when they're lost, but don't want to alarm the crowd. He wandered into the garden. There, beneath the old Bodhi tree, he had once felt closest to the divine. He remembered praying here for hours, or at least he remembered remembering. But now the tree was just a tree. The breeze was just wind. The silence was not sacred. It was empty. Not peaceful. Vacant. He sat anyway, trying to reconstruct the ritual. Hands folded, eyes lowered, breath controlled. But it all felt ridiculous, like an actor rehearsing lines for a role he no longer believed in. Suddenly, a thought struck him, sharp, unwelcome. What if I was never truly devoted, just trained? What if I mistook habit for holiness? What if everything I thought I was just a name spoken enough times to feel real? He stood quickly, as if running from the weight of his own doubt. He paced the monastery grounds, desperate to feel something. Recognition, belonging, a sign, a pull, a voice, anything. But the world around him was mute. The gods were silent. Even his own thoughts began to stutter. He passed by a boy sweeping the courtyard. The boy looked up and said gently, "Master, are you all right?" He opened his mouth, then paused, then answered, "I think I have forgotten who I am." The boy laughed innocently. "As in, spiritually?" The monk stared at him. "No," he whispered. "As in, completely. That night, he did not eat, nor did he sleep. He simply sat, staring at the moon, wondering if she still knew his name. And for the first time in over 2 decades, he did not pray. Not because he was angry, not because he had turned away from the divine, but because he no longer knew who was supposed to be praying. Somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the walls, a wolf howled, not at the moon, but at the ache of being forgotten. And he wondered, was the wolf howling for him? Or was it him finally beginning to howl? They say that when a person loses something, he begins to retrace his steps. But what if the thing he's lost was never really his? What if the name he carried was just a cloak handed down, threaded with borrowed meanings and soft, well-worn lies? At dawn, the monk rose again, but this time not as a disciple of devotion, this time as a stranger in his own skin. He began to search, not outside at first, but inward. He closed his eyes, sat beneath the old Bodhi tree, and whispered the question into his breath. Who was I before they named me? There was no answer, only wind brushing his ear like the memory of something he once knew, but no longer understood. So he stood and began to walk. Outside the monastery walls, the world was raw. No ritual, no incense, no robes, no chants, just dirt paths, crooked fences, and strangers who never once called him by name. He welcomed it. He walked until he found a boy near a riverbank. The child was building a tiny bridge out of sticks and stones, murmuring to himself. The monk knelt beside him and asked, "What are you building, little one?" The boy said, "A bridge, so the ants can cross to the other side." The monk smiled faintly. "And what's on the other side?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know, but maybe they're tired of this side." The monk stared at the child. He had no name for himself. But this boy, this strange little creature, had purpose. Tiny, beautiful, free. Before the monk left, he asked the boy, "Do you know my name?" The boy squinted. "Number. Should I?" The monk paused. "No," he said softly. "No, you shouldn't." He walked further until he came to a quiet village. There, by a shrine carved from broken stone, an old beggar sat beneath a tree, eyes closed, face serene. The monk approached. "Have you found peace?" he asked. The beggar opened one eye and smiled. "No," he said. "I lost everything instead." The monk sat beside him. "I've lost something too. My name, my memory of prayer, my identity." The beggar chuckled. "Lucky man. Most spend their whole lives trying to lose such things." The monk frowned. "It doesn't feel lucky." "No," the beggar said. "It feels like dying." "But what comes after?" The beggar tilted his head. "That depends. Did your name define you, or were you hiding inside it?" The monk left in silence, not confused, but stirred, as if a crack had begun to open inside him, and instead of light, it was letting in truth. Raw, quiet, uncomfortable. By nightfall, he came upon a lone tree, dry, withering, its bark flaking, its branches bare. He sat beneath it and stared upward. Once it had bloomed. Once it had given shade. Now it simply stood, not resisting death, not fearing it, just being. He reached out, touched the bark. Rough, cold, alive, in its own quiet way. "Do you remember your green days?" he whispered to the tree. It said nothing, and that silence felt holy. That night, he dreamt of a face he didn't recognize, A child, perhaps, or himself, or a god pretending to be both. The face did not speak, only watched, and in that gaze he felt both seen and erased. When he woke the next morning, he was not healed, not whole, but softer, not because he'd remembered who he was, but because he was beginning to unlearn who he wasn't. He had met a boy who built bridges, a beggar who lost everything to find peace, and a tree that taught him how to die standing. None of them called his name, none of them cared for it, and yet each one reflected a piece of him. A child's curiosity, a beggar's surrender, a tree's stillness. Perhaps, he thought, I was never meant to remember my name. I was meant to become the silence beneath it. And so he returned to the monastery, not because he found answers, but because he found enough mystery to begin again, not as a monk, not as a seeker, but as a question. Breathing. When a man stops searching, the world begins to speak, not in answers, but in echoes, in breaths, in birdsong, in the spaces between thoughts where truth used to hide, patiently, waiting to be forgotten. The monk returned to the monastery quietly, not like one who'd come home, but like a stranger walking through the ruins of a former life. He no longer looked for his name, no longer reached for mantras or scrolls or sacred duties. He simply moved, softly, like wind between walls. And it was in that movement, that absence of striving, that something began to unfold. He swept the floor, as he always had, but now he didn't do it as a monk. He did it as a witness, a hand holding a broom, a body following the breath of dust. He ate simple meals, not with mindfulness, but with quiet wonder, tasting not the food, but the act of tasting itself. And slowly, something strange began to happen. The others began to forget his name too. They no longer called him to lead chants. They no longer asked for teachings. They passed him in the corridor with warm glances, but no titles, no questions, as if the silence around him had grown contagious. But he was not invisible. No, something deeper was taking root. He was becoming transparent, not unseen, but clear, like a glass bowl, empty but still able to hold, like a sky, so open even the clouds felt free to pass through. One evening, a novice approached him. "Master," the boy said carefully, "why do you no longer teach?" The monk looked at him, eyes soft with a kindness that had no need to explain itself. "I used to teach," he said, "because I thought I had something to give. Now I sit in silence because I realize the giving was never mine." The boy frowned. "But don't you miss being someone?" The monk smiled. "Being someone," he said, "was the heaviest thing I ever carried." That night, he walked out beyond the monastery gates, not far, just to the edge where the forest kissed the earth. He lay beneath the stars, alone, but not lonely. He watched the sky without naming it. He listened to the breeze without labeling its direction. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel the need to understand a single thing. A thought passed through him, not like a voice, but like a ripple in a lake. You were never your name. You were never your robes. You were never even your prayers. You were the space between all those things. The listening, not the song. The silence, not the speech. The presence, not the person. And for the first time in many years, he wept, not from grief, not from confusion, but from the unbearable lightness of being no one. The next morning, he returned to the monastery with the same bare feet, the same robe, the same empty hands. But everything had changed. Not because he found what was missing, but because he had realized nothing had ever been missing. It was only the veil of identity that had whispered otherwise. He passed his brothers in the hallway. They nodded. He nodded back. No one called his name. No one needed to. He was no longer trying to be remembered. He was finally remembering everything else. The sound of wind in bamboo, the trembling of light on water, the softness of walking with no destination. The monk who had forgotten his name had become the one who no longer needed one, not because he lost himself, but because he had shed the illusion that he was ever anything more than a moment of God passing through a body. And in that quiet, he discovered the most sacred secret. To be no one is not emptiness, it is freedom. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, just without comment. The monk, still without a name, became a presence in the monastery, like the wind or the candlelight or the space between bells. He no longer taught, but others began to gather near him, not for words, but for how quiet they felt in his company. He said little, smiled often, listened always. Even the abbot noticed. The monk who had forgotten who he was now the one others quietly became near. One day, during a midday meal, a messenger arrived. He carried scrolls, wore fine sandals, spoke the way people do when they believe words make them important. He addressed the gathering monks with a deep bow. "I bring a request," he said. "The elder council in the southern province seeks a spiritual guide, someone to lead the temple, to counsel kings and villagers alike. They have chosen him." And with that, he pointed to him. To the monk with no name, all eyes turned, the room held its breath. The monk looked up from his simple bowl of rice, not startled, not proud, just present. He placed the bowl down, wiped his hands on his robe, and asked gently, why me?" The messenger recited, "Because your teachings have spread. Even your silence has echoed across mountains. Your former name is known far and wide." At that word, name, the monk smiled faintly, as one smiles at a song they used to love, but now understand too well to sing. He did not refuse nor accept. He simply said, "That man no longer lives here." The room was still. Someone asked, "But aren't you the same monk?" He replied, "I was a shape once. Now I am the space it left behind." The messenger persisted. "Your wisdom could help thousands." The monk nodded. "Then let them find what I found, not through me, but through what remains when me is no longer in the way." Later, alone beneath the Bodhi tree, the novice boy returned. "Master," he whispered, "why did you turn down the honor?" The monk looked up at the sky, where a single white cloud passed like a thought unspoken. He answered slowly, "Because a name is a net, and I have tasted too much sky." The boy sat beside him. "Do you remember your name now?" he asked. The monk smiled. "Yes." "And still, you don't use it?" He nodded. "I remember it the way you remember a childhood friend, with love, but no need to return. Far away, the world would go on. Temples would rise. Names would be praised. Kings would seek counsel. Crowds would chant for answers. But this monk, who once forgot himself so completely he vanished, now lived as the pure presence beneath all noise. He had not renounced the world, he had simply stopped mistaking it for himself. And so, when the calling returned, the call to rise again, to lead, to be someone, he did not answer, not out of rejection, not out of pride, but because some things are so sacred, they must remain unanswered. To be no one, fully, without apology, is to hear the world's questions and realize they were never yours to answer. The seasons changed, not quickly, not dramatically, but like someone gently turning the page of a book they've already read and finally understand. The monastery remained. So did the tree. So did the monk. But he was not still. He was simply no longer moving with the world's urgency. He had become like water in a deep well, motionless on the surface, but pulsing with mystery below. Then, one morning, it happened. The wind returned. After months, maybe years, of silence, it moved again through the stone corridors. It brushed the paper walls. It danced among the prayer flags like fingers remembering a forgotten instrument. And with it came a sound. Software barely formed, but unmistakable. It whispered his name. He heard it, and this time he smiled. Not because he longed for it, not because he believed in it again, but because he now understood what it really was. Not a title, not an identity, but a sound the wind makes when passing through the shape of who he once thought he was. He walked through the monastery that day as one walks through the memory of a dream. A few monks called to him, this time with warmth, this time with recognition, not just of a name, but of presence. But he did not answer, not because he was avoiding, but because there was nothing left to defend. He no longer needed to be seen to know he existed. Later that evening, the novice boy approached him again. "Master, the wind spoke your name today." The monk nodded. "I know. Will you answer it?" He looked up. The stars were just beginning to appear. Their silence felt familiar. He said, "No, because now I know. It's not calling me, it's calling through me." He sat beneath the Bodhi tree one final time, not to seek, not to reflect, just to be. He listened to the wind, not as a message, but as music. And in that moment, his name passed through him like a flute held to the lips of the infinite, not to bind him, but to bless the emptiness he had become. They say he died many years later, not with ceremony, not with notice. One morning, his robe was found folded beneath the tree. His sandals were left by the river. No body, no note, only wind. And some say, if you listen, really listen, you might still hear his name being carried across the mountains. But not as a label, not as a memory, only as a sound that once belonged to someone who became no one. So completely that the wind itself became his voice.